Hi, welcome to A Lamp in the Library. I'm Graham.
And I'm Kim. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our July book haul, which is going to feature books that we're going to be reading for the rest of July and into August.
So I decided to read more sci-fi this summer because I think it's a fun genre to read. A little bit of light reading, but as you know, we're recording this during the global COVID-19 pandemic. So I choose this kind of deep cut from Kim Stanley Robinson. It's called The Years of Rice and Salt. And it's about if the Black Death happened in the 14th century in Europe and killed a third of the population of Europe, what happened? What would happen if it was 99% of the population of Europe? How would the world evolve in that situation? So that's the premise of this book. Kind of plague oriented. Yes. So it's topical to some degree, and yeah, going to be interesting.
Do you find that books about global pandemics is something that you're sort of drawn to right now because of what's happening, or is there a little bit of it maybe hitting a little too close to home?
Yeah, I think some of it's hitting a bit too close to home, but when the pandemic was first, starting up back in February, March, I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and that was about a global pandemic, a much worse global pandemic. So I don't know, it was interesting reading that book because it was just kind of like was resonating with what was happening in the world, but in this kind of fantastical way, because it was obviously much more severe. So it kind of made me feel calmer about the actual pandemic because the fictional pandemic was so much worse. So it's weird. But then I also read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and that had some plague in it as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm attracted to plague books, but it's interesting. It's interesting to read about them during this time. That's for sure.
So I'm going to share two books because they're by the same author, and that is On Dialogue and Wholeness of the Implicate Order. And both of them are by a brilliant physicist by the name of David Bohm. I've heard about Bohm before because he actually has a bit of an interesting history in that he worked with Oppenheimer and he worked with Einstein.
That's why I recognize that name.
Yeah, and he was very respected, but then his ideas were going outside the mainstream and he almost got sort of shunned by the scientific community, and partly because he seemed to be interested in really looking at consciousness and maybe more as sort of this title is insinuating, like a universal, a whole sort of consciousness. And a lot of my books this month are looking at consciousness because I'm very interested in that topic. So I really wanted to dive a little bit into his work specifically. And, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to follow it along. It does actually have some, mathematical equations within it. So I'm sure it's far beyond me at the same time, but I'm very curious to see what he puts forward. And then this book is actually more just about the nature of communication and how we communicate and how to have dialogue. So I'm also very interested in this book, especially when it comes from someone who ended up being very much criticized and, as I said, sort of shunned in the community that he was in, and that being the scientific community. I think there's recently been a bit of more interest in his work because what he was working on and some of his ideas are more, people are coming around to them now, whereas in before it was just, he was like clearly before his time.
So if he was working with those guys, Oppenheimer, etc., do you think he took this kind of left turn into more spiritual thinking or thinking about consciousness and things like that because of the work he was doing? Or
that's interesting. I'm not sure. I know there's actually a free documentary up about him on YouTube right now that you can just watch. So I'd really like to watch that. Maybe we can watch it together and even share what we thought about it, because it might get into that. I don't know his biography too much, but it'd be hard to imagine that the work that you were doing and then seeing the consequences of the field of work that you are, physics, and what happened, how that wouldn't have a huge impact on you and your views of the world and the universe. So
Oh, I also have this other book by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is a new omnibus version of his Three Californias trilogy, which includes The Wild Shore, The Gold Coast, and Pacific Edge. And I bought this book because I heard someone say that the best utopian novel ever written is The Pacific Edge.
Oh.
So I think I'm going to read that one because I think the other two are more dystopias. And again, we're living in a global pandemic. So I think I'd like to read something that has a hopeful kind of spin on, you know, where humanity could go if things went right. You know, because it seems right now that things are going very much in a poor direction. So it'd be nice to, I think, you know, just to put my mind in a more positive, you know, outlook about the future of humanity. So that's what attracted me to this particular book. I've read other Kim Stanley Robinson books that have a kind of a utopian edge to them, like his Mars trilogy, very utopian. And yeah, it really makes you think about how humanity could achieve, you know, greatness, and
How we're falling short.
how we're currently falling very short, yeah.
The next book that I got was Morphic Resonance by Rupert Sheldrake. And Rupert Sheldrake is someone that I've been familiar with for a while with some of his work and watching some of his talks and listening to him. And I'm very excited to read this because while I'm sort of familiar with the idea of morphic resonance from hearing him talk, he is very much interested in concepts of consciousness, and he believes in there being some more of like, there's more consciousness in the world and in the universe than we're currently aware of, because we tend to equate consciousness very much with just like animals, and he sees it not just within minerals and plants, but he also sometimes thinks about, you know, is there consciousness in something like the sun? And I just find his inquiries very interesting. He's also a scientist who ended up being very much shunned by the scientific community when he started pushing more of these ideas of looking at consciousness forward. And he's a very, very intelligent and very interesting man who, you know, a lot of it is just posing the questions and thinking about them first. So I'm really looking forward to getting more into depth of the concept of morphic resonance, which I think I'll be able to talk about more once I've finished the book, of course. And yeah, I really recommend even just hearing him talk a bit. He actually has a TED Talk that was banned for a bit because he was talking about concepts of morphic resonance. So, and I think it's really important when saying these things that these aren't fringe scientists that are like conspiracy theorists, because I feel like maybe with saying certain things that might come across, but that's not the case at all. You know, it's not the same as someone who doesn't believe in climate change or something. That's not the case at all. If anything, I think these are thinkers ahead of their time and pushing us to think beyond the limitations that we have put upon concepts of what is consciousness and what can even just be achieved by us as beings. So.
Wow, that's some pretty esoteric stuff. So, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe partly, I don't know, maybe it is also for me in a different direction because of what's happening in the world and the pandemic, but also the realization that we're just moving forward in a way that can have a lot of devastating impacts on our earth and humanity and everything else that lives in it, has really brought even more to front my interest in looking at what binds us all together so that we can work all together.
Wow, those are some interesting ideas. I read The Secret Life of Trees last summer, and you know, that had some, you know, pretty radical ideas. I think when the book was first released, it was, you know, pretty radical in terms of talking about, you know, trees have these networks and familial relationships, and you know, it sounds crazy, but when you read the book, it's very much grounded in science and the latest thinking. So I think, you know, scientific thinking is changing on all of these things.
But it's still, what I find interesting, a part of that conversation is, though there's like an element within the community that is very hesitant to think of, for instance, the network of how trees communicate as a sort of like in relation to like how a brain works in a human. They're just like, no, no, no. And I mean, those are really interesting conversations and discussions to have. And I'm glad that there are scholars and philosophers and scientists out there really posing the questions and working to try to uncover some of the answers.
Yeah, I guess it's having an open mind, but, you know, within the scientific method, and, you know, not being so open-minded that you're letting in, you know, like you said, conspiracy theorists, but being open to new concepts and new ways of looking at the world and how it works.
Yeah.
So I've slowly been working through everything that Ursula Le Guin has written. I have not yet read any of her Earthsea books, which are beloved, I guess. So I bought this used copy of the first one, A Wizard of Earthsea. I think it's considered YA, but Ursula Le Guin, classic, fantastic science fiction, fantasy writer, and I'm looking forward to finally reading this.
I kind of like the cover.
Yeah, we should do a whole episode on fantasy and sci-fi covers, because they're very different from any other cover art in that the expectation is that you depict something that is literally in the story, and the more fantastical the better. And sometimes the most B-grade covers are the best, but this is pretty subtle.
Yeah, that one's not too fantastical, but
within the genre. So anyway, I'm looking forward to this one.
So I'm keeping with my theme, and my next book is Galileo's Arrow. So I'm keeping with my theme, and the next book I have is Galileo's Error. It's by Philip Goff, not Goth. But maybe he's gothy, I don't know. He is a philosopher, and this again is going with the consciousness look, and he's more looking at it from a philosophical side. And from what I understand, he talks a lot about the concept of panpsychism, and so I believe this book is him trying to put forward more arguments for panpsychism, which again, panpsychism is more based upon the notions of looking at consciousness in the variety forms of life on Earth, whereas like the universal consciousness is more looking at even like a consciousness that may be beyond Earth. So as I said, Rupert Sheldrake, he was, you know, sometimes poses the question of like, is the sun conscious? But this is, panpsychism, from what I understand, is much more like earthbound in its thought. But I'm curious to read this book. I read a bit of a Guardian review of it, which, you know, was a good review, but was also pointing out maybe some of the limits of his arguments. But I'm curious to see that for myself. And also, again, it's just about looking at new questions and like maybe looking for answers we didn't even know that we weren't asking the questions to. So yeah, I'm excited for it.
Interesting. So my last book is called The Walking Whales, From Land to Water in 8 Million Years.
Now that's a good cover.
By J.G.M. Hans Thewissen. He is Dutch, I believe. Yes, speaking of cover art, this cover art is fantastic, and I have a interest in paleo art, and this book is full of these fantastical illustrations of whales who, interestingly to know, evolved from land mammals. So kind of like dog-like creatures, over 8 million years evolved into what we know now to be whales. That's fascinating. So this book is the story of that process. So apparently the author went to Pakistan just before the Iraq War, the first Iraq War broke out, and he actually was kicked out of the country because of politics. And before doing so, he made this fantastical discovery of the kind of lost link between land mammals and whales. So the book is about that, you know, scientific discovery and the process, and trying to reconstruct these lost creatures with some really excellent cover art. Let me give you the name of the artist, if I can, with illustrations by Jacqueline Dillard. So check this one out, The Walking Whales. So that's what we're reading in the month of July and August. So we'll give you an update on what we think of all these books, or if we even made it through them all.
Yeah.
But let's share what we're reading now.
Yeah. So I'll go first. I'm currently pretty close to done, actually, this book called Tattoos on the Heart by Gregory Boyle. And Boyle is a Jesuit priest, and he founded Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. And so in the area of Los Angeles that he lives and work is a very poor neighborhood, and it has a lot of gang violence. And this book isn't so much about, it's not about the starting of Homeboy Industries, you know, it's not the history of that. In this book, he's sharing these like remarkable stories of the young men and the young women he meets and works with, and who end up working with Homeboy Industries because they want to get out of gang life and they want to change their own lives. And it's a really, really remarkable book. Like as you can imagine, there's a lot of sadness in the book because of just the excessive amount of trauma that these people face, and then the work they do to overcome it. But at the same time, like, Boyle's funny and he has a lot of elements of humor in it, and it's actually a fairly quick read because they're just these kind of short snippets of things that he's come across. And what's beautiful about the book too is, as I said, it's not a focus on how he started Homeboy Industries or how Homeboy Industries is run now. The focus is on these amazing people that he's met and sharing, you know, lessons that he's learned through working with all these amazing people. And it's not even so much about him, the Jesuit priest, as it is these amazing men and women that he has met through Homeboy Industries and his work as a Jesuit priest. So again, that is Tattoos on the Heart. And I think it's a book that really illustrates how incredibly powerful compassion is to the world and how life-changing it can be. And that's self-compassion too, because it really highlights that for some of the men and women.
Wow. So I am currently reading this book. It's called Dead Astronauts by Jeff Vandermeer. And I really like this author. He's probably most well known for his Southern Reach trilogy. But he also wrote a book called Born, and this is kind of sort of a sequel to that book. But it's very experimental writing. But I think what he does in the genre of science fiction is he really is addressing the ecological crisis in a really unique and interesting way. And that's, I guess that's, if you're interested in that kind of writing, he's very weird. This book is very experimental. But he's really looking, like, to go back to what we were saying earlier about consciousness, he's really looking at, you know, the consciousness that is in, you know, non-human life, you know, other life forms that we share the planet with. And, you know, they're I guess this is a, you know, in contrast to Kim Stanley Robinson, this is a very dystopian book, but it is a beautiful dystopia, and it goes into how non-human life is kind of replacing humans. Anyway, very strange book, very experimental writing, but I'm into it.
Yeah, I plan to read it once Graham is finished, because I've read his Southern Reach trilogy and Born, so I'm looking forward to reading it. And then, well, maybe we can make an episode where we discuss our reactions to Dead Astronauts.
Thanks so much for watching A Lamp in the Library. If you liked what you saw, give us a thumbs up. If you want to discuss any of the books that we talked about, or even the books that you're thinking of reading this summer, let us know in the comments. And we'll be back next week with more bookish discussions.
And don't forget to subscribe so you will be notified when we have a new episode up. Thanks so much for watching.
Keep well and keep reading.